Great. Thank you very much, Melissa. Melissa's given us a very brief introduction to the development progress project, or actually it's more accurately described as a program because it's quite a large number of activities. But I wanted to just say a few words by way of introduction, both to the project and the 4 case studies that we're publishing today, and also to try and relate them and particularly the Nexus concept to broader progress over the last 20 years, which is the period that the development progress has been looking at. As Melissa highlighted, the project aims to help us understand what we mean by development progress, and it's producing 28 case studies, country-based case studies, looking at various dimensions. And 4 of those case studies have an environmental focus, and those are the ones that we're publishing today. We've already published, I think 8, on case studies altogether, on health and education, and there'll be another series of launch events for case studies under other issues. But today we're focusing on the 4 that have an environmental focus. And of course, when you think about development progress and you think about progress in an environmental way, you get quite a different perspective. Those of you who've been listening to the news today will have heard that one great environmental success story, progress if you like, is the if you like, saving of the ozone layer. At the same time, almost in the same newspapers, we hear about increased CO2 emissions carrying on ad infinitum almost. So it's a very mixed story in terms of the environmental side of development. And I wanted to say a few words by way of introduction about the sort of broader picture, and my colleagues here will talk more specifically about the case studies. First of all, on the Nexus itself, as again, as Melissa's pointed out, the 4 case studies for Brazil, Burkina Faso, China, and Vietnam were not originally designed with a Nexus framing, if you like. But if you apply a Nexus lens to the analysis in those case studies, you get a highlighted, I think, understanding of how progress has taken place in those 4 countries, and particularly how policymakers and other actors in those countries have balanced human and social development and economic progress with environmental objectives, or not, as the case may be. Well, I'll leave that to the case studies. The Nexus, I think is particularly important for this. The Nexus idea, I think, is particularly important for this discussion because one of the key aspects of it, if you like, is a recognition that policy objectives aimed at one particular sector have implications for policy objectives in another. This may be because of, for instance, that there may be, if you like, preconditions from one sector that affect what could be done in another. Let me give you an example, which is a very live example at the moment and not touched by the case studies. If you want to build a few coal-fired power stations to address energy objectives, you need a large amount of water to cool the power stations. Clearly, there's an implication between one sector and another there. And you're not going to build your coal-fired power stations if you don't have the water. If that water resource has other uses, then potentially you might be taking that water away from those other uses, for instance, agriculture, and you can see the connections there. And therefore, it's important to understand that the policy implications and policy making tends to be siloed. Even if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the shaping of them, the way they've been put together, tends to be in kind of sectoral boxes. But the implications of decisions made in one box for another box are pretty clear, and the Nexus concept helps us unpick all of that. So before we get to thinking about the case studies, one of the questions we wanted to ask was, what can we learn when looking at development progress over the last 20 years by applying a Nexus lens to that progress? We attempted to do some of this just by looking at the data that's readily available. As most of you know, that there are pretty good data series on food, on energy and water, certainly using some indicators. And from a human development perspective, we can say that there has been progress, broadly speaking, in those three areas over the past 2 decades. More than 2.3 billion people have gained access to an improved drinking water source. 1.7 billion people have gained access to electricity. And the proportion of people who are undernourished in the total population has reduced over the 20 years from 24% to 14%. Not quite the MDG, but on the way. That development progress has been accompanied by resource consumption. Also, you need to bear in mind that those broad indicators hide, if you like, differences between and within countries. They don't reflect any kind of quality aspect in terms of the progress that has been achieved. And of course, they don't say much about environmental sustainability. But broadly speaking, not discounting those kind of differences across the world, we can say that there has been human development progress, and that's been accompanied by the consumption of resources. And that consumption of resources has been pretty significant, and that's why we're having the debate about human development and environmental sustainability. For instance, annual freshwater withdrawals per capita over the 2 decades increased substantially in East Asia and the Pacific and in sub-Saharan Africa, although they decreased in many other regions. In energy, as I've mentioned, CO2 emissions continue to increase. Also, if you look at energy, the data on the proportion of electricity globally that comes from renewable sources in 1990 is pretty much the same as it is today. There hasn't been, at least in proportional terms, that much change. Food production has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. And in some areas of the world, the area devoted to agriculture has increased substantially. In Asia, for example, it's getting on for 27%, a 27% increase in the land area devoted to agriculture in Asia. That resource consumption has environmental sustainability implications. But looking at those data, we're looking at it still from a sectoral perspective. And the question I was trying to ask myself looking at this was, what can we say about the interdependencies between these sectors over the last 20 years, and can that tell us anything about development progress or the relationship between human and economic development and environmental sustainability? Because the sectors are clearly interdependent. We do have data that says 70% of agriculture, 70% of water withdrawals are for agriculture. The Millennium Development Goals have focused on human consumption of water and clean drinking water, which is only about 10% of total water withdrawals. The energy sector accounts for another 10 to 15% of water consumption. So expansion in one area clearly has implications for another. But if we look at the interdependencies, one of the big challenges is we actually don't have much data available to tell us anything, at least in standard indicator series. We do have series that tell us something about freshwater use for agriculture. We do have data that tells us something about the energy intensity of agriculture. We don't have any series that tell us anything about water consumption for energy, despite the World Bank's focus on thirsty energy, despite discussions last week at Stockholm on the water energy nexus. The data series historically on the consumption of water for energy is actually pretty sketchy. You'd have to do quite a lot of research to get to understand what that is. We looked at the indicators that we've got, freshwater withdrawals for agriculture and energy intensity for agriculture, and tried to correlate the data that we do have with other indicators, particularly indicators around human development, the Human Development Index, indicators on resource intensity, that's the quantity of resource required to produce a unit of GDP, and also on resource efficiency. How much energy do you need to produce how much energy, if you like? We did some correlations. We correlated the data that was available for a limited number of countries, because that's all that is available, using both the levels of the indicators and the changes over the 20-year period of those indicators. The correlations didn't really tell us anything. There are some weak correlations, but nothing particularly comes out when you look at that, if you like, pure statistic analysis that really tells us very much. And so we have to ask ourselves why, given the intuitive and, if you like, to some extent empirical understanding of the relationship between the sectors. And I think that one of the main reasons, well, the two main reasons. One is the problem with the data, and we maybe just don't have enough data to be able to do that. A lot of the research that has been done on the Nexus, by the way, it does use modeling, integrated assessment modeling, but that's all used for forecasting for the future. Very little of it can be used for looking at the past. So there are data limitations, but I think also one of the things we need to think about here is also the fact that when we're dealing with just water, energy, and food, three pretty complex systems in themselves, consider the relationships between the complexities of those systems and their interactions with each other. Consider the complexities of that taking place in countries with different geographies, with different levels of development, with different sets of institutions. It begins to see that actually, well, maybe looking at the nexus and from that pure statistical point of view is perhaps not the right approach. And that segues very neatly into the suggestion that, well, let's look at the case studies, because they've taken a slightly different approach, and see what we can learn, because a lot of the understanding seems to be that you've got to be pretty context specific to really understand how the nexus takes place and how those trade-offs and synergies are going to be managed. And at this point, I'll stop.
Okay.